start by saying that I'm American, though of course my family is Chinese via Taiwan, and I began. Well, professionally, I studied architecture, anthropology, and then design history. But I began professionally actually as a journalist and writer when I was living in New York, writing for a number of publications. I started, as happens to many writers in our field, I started being asked to curate small projects here and there, and then of course over the years the proportion of writing versus curating totally shifted. In 2008, I sort of on a whim moved to Beijing, basically just to hang out while writing. It was during the Olympic period, so there was no shortage of interest for stories from China at that time. But then I was soon appointed creative director for Beijing Design Week. After that, I moved to Hong Kong, where I was lead curator for the new M+ Museum. This was in 2012 when I started. As you may have heard, M+ just opened finally a few weeks ago. But there I was responsible for overseeing the formation of the design and architecture collection and team and program. Soon after, about 6 years after moving to Hong Kong, I left for Shanghai, where I continued doing a number of freelance projects, but also I took up a professorship at the College of Design and Innovation at Tongji University, where I founded the curatorial lab and was doing other projects, including my role as curatorial director for the Design Miami fairs in Miami and Basel. And then just 3 months ago, I moved to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where I begun full-time as the new general and artistic director of Het Nieuwe Institute, or the New Institute, which is sort of like the Dutch National Museum and Institute for Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture. Well, the past, present, future kind of stems from the fact that we house the Dutch National Collection of Architecture and Urban Planning. And of course, it's a very rich collection with, I think, over 4 million objects and archival documents. It's one of the largest architecture collections in the world, and it's a really rich resource that I think allows us not only to sort of revisit the way in which we tell the narratives of the past, and as I'm sure you're aware, this is a real priority for institutions all over the world to use their collections to really be able to speak about their histories more inclusively, and to sort of decolonize these narratives and so on and so forth. And that's something that I feel really fortunate with, because there is already a very strong built-in ethos here at the Institute for sort of questioning everything. And so it really is this this reevaluation of the collection is something that is already going full steam ahead in very exciting ways. Now, from that, we can begin to think about heritage as innovation, sort of, what was once heritage or what is heritage now was once innovative. We can innovate now by learning from what we can see in our heritage, but we can also sort of innovate what heritage means. Heritage as a kind of living, changing organism. Really, a heritage is not something that is static, but it's something that is in fact defined by the present and also the future in terms of what we want heritage to mean moving forward. So that's all very exciting. Now, in the meantime, excuse me, we are also we have a very strong research ethos that has allowed us to really tackle some of the most pressing and concerning issues of our day in both sort of contemporary and speculative contexts, excuse me. So I think, before I came, the Institute was really quite early in exploring the area of biomaterials, automation, more than human practices and worldviews and so on and so forth. And that's something that we'll continue with. Now, in terms of the the disciplines, I think what is really, we've gone through this exercise here, about kind of defining who we are, because, we are a funny creature. We do lots of different things. We have a kind of vague name, the New Institute. What does that really mean? We have a kind of interesting history in that we were formed only 8 years ago, but through the merger of 3 previous institutes. So we're a young institute with a very long history, in fact. And so, that sort of one-liner that I just gave you in introducing myself, the Dutch National Institute of of Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture, is really what we are. But the sort of the big asterisk to that is every single one of those terms is being questioned and expanded, and reevaluated, not just by us, but within the contemporary condition that we're operating. So if we start with Dutch, here in the Netherlands, as in other countries, there are questions about what Dutchness means. And I think the fact that, the Dutch this Dutch National Museum hired a Chinese American director already sort of says something now. National, what does national mean in this kind of a post-global period that we're now witnessing, in which we're both more interconnected and fragmented than ever before, or at least in recent compared to if you look at recent decades. Institute, what is an institute now? What is its role? Institutes play different, especially at a time when different practices of knowledge generation and dissemination and centralization versus decentralization are being questioned. And then, of course, architecture, design, and digital culture. These are all areas, all disciplines that, of course, are coming from histories of their own that have defined them, largely in the Euro-American sphere through the through the evolution of various discourses and sort of institutional evolutions and so on and so forth. But of course, they're all being sort of they're all kind of shape shifting and sort of morphing beyond their conventional or traditional borders.
Really exciting for us to probably know more and engage more with the Institute and what you're doing there.
One of the things that you did say was about the idea of redefining a lot of these things. I was very curious about the archive, because in a lot of your projects, including X is not a small country, you started with an archival object. So I was wondering about what does the archive mean in this situation?
Yeah, well, maybe we should start by also asking what the relationship between the term archive and collection, because in fact we purposely call our trove of archival materials a collection, because archives imply a kind of completeness of documentation or evidence or production, when in fact, of course, any archive, as any archivist will tell you, is highly curated and selected, right? I mean, it's so we try to be very transparent in saying that what we have is a collection, not an archive, in acknowledging that our holdings are based on selections, we acknowledge also that there will inevitably be biases, that were built into it. Now, that being said, knowing this, what can we do with archives beyond the kind of traditional scholarship, which is still something that we, of course, value and support. And one of the things that we're doing is developing new tools for annotating archives through our Collecting Otherwise initiative in a way that sort of puts an asterisk literally next to the records that we have, to point out that there are other ways of that there are omissions and prejudices and so on and so forth kind of built into to how these materials were collected, how they were selected, and then how they were have been interpreted in the past. Now, looking forward, we're also bringing in other kinds of archives, both, in terms of feminist archives, looking at queering space and so on and so forth. And we also have brought in archives of informal architecture or informal appropriations of architecture, which I think could be interesting for India, where you are, where there's such a rich discourse around informal urbanism and architecture and design. In our case, it was through the assemblage of an archive of squatting. There's been a sort of long history of squatting here in the Netherlands. Again, going even further, you mentioned the MVRDV H&I exhibition, which you just opened, which was coinciding with the with the opening just next to us of this sort of spectacular depot that MVRDV designed for the Boijmans Van Beuningen Museum. There you can see it right outside my window. And this show draws from the MVRDV archive, which we hold, or at least we hold the first 400 projects up until 2015. And so we wanted to show how there are other ways of adding to voices within an archive, of interpreting and seeing an archive, while also new possibilities for developing tools, especially given the very high preponderance of digital material in the archive. So in addition to the sort of models and drawings that we show and the oral histories that we've brought in, we also commissioned a number of practitioners to create these digital tools, and they're kind of fantastic. Like it's everything from an algorithm that searches for terms through all of MVRDV's emails up until 2015, and then plots the frequency of terms, which allows you to sort of draw conclusions about both the evolution of the firm itself, the evolution of architectural practices or priorities within architectural practice. How often the word sustainability comes up, for example, as a very simple instance. Or the professionalization of that firm. Suddenly in the 2000s, the word budget and contract, suddenly the words budget and contract suddenly start to peak. To more speculative tools from the archive. Alice Bucknell created a video game, which was speculating about a post-apocalyptic world in which all architectural archives have been destroyed except for the server containing the MVRDV archive. So how do we rebuild a world using just MVRDV's digital drawings and renderings? And then she made a video game out of that. So again, these are all different ways in which we can use archives to imagine how we not only understand the past, but also the present, and potentially think about the future as well.
So interestingly, there are a few keywords that you used while you were speaking earlier, and especially decolonizing and decentering, and this growing talk and awareness about those topics. While everybody's talking about it and engaging with it and introspecting themselves in some way, there is still, most institutions still end up having a center or a position of sorts. While you have a trajectory that really spans from west to east and then back to west, it might be very interesting for us to know, how do you manage to shift constantly, and what you aim to bring to these institutions given your diverse exposure to different perspectives that you've had?
Yeah, well, I think first, the first thing to sort of really remember is that, and maybe this sounds too sort of lowbrow philosophical, but really, like, nothing exists without its context, right? Everything and anything is defined by its context. There's nothing that is fully autonomous or has meaning in isolation. So I think that applies to everything one does. In fact, I guess I can also relate this to my background in journalism, which I'm sure you can relate to, is that, everything you look at, everything you write about, what's the first thing you do? You have to understand the context, not only the context of the subject matter in order to understand what the subject matter is, but also the context of how and to whom you're communicating it to, right? So, when I was a journalist, I was always freelance. So I was writing for the whole range of publications, from ranging from very, very sort of mass market and consumerist, to much more kind of rarefied, discursive, even academic publications. So it's everything from, what I hope was serious criticism to, like, 10 hot new restaurants, in London, those kinds of stories. And obviously, you would write each of those stories, you would write for each of those situations differently, and it's understanding about context. And it's the same for my work, not just geographically and culturally, because you're right, I've worked in different contexts in that respect, but also format too. I've worked on design weeks, architecture biennials, design fairs, museums, and so on and so forth. And of course, the way you would curate a show for Design Miami is different than how you would curate a show for the Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology in Lisbon, which is the show the venue that Devanshi was referring to earlier. But I think in that sense, it's and I've talked about this before, but I think in that sense, it's always important to sort of maintain a critical distance and to in some ways be an outsider and to sort of acknowledge your outsider-ness, to sort of play the role of perpetual observer, right? So to go back to Devanshi's example from Matt, X is not a small country. Yes, we sort of were used as a provocation in archival, historical poster that's iconic in Portugal, a 1934 poster made during that country's sort of very nationalist, quasi-fascist period. Again, as a kind of spark for the show, and also spark for conversations within Portugal. But of course, I'm not someone who's by any means well placed to do a show on Portuguese post-colonialism, right? So it was sort of then expanded really to a kind of global, a more global or even globalized or post-global framework. But we made that sort of local reference as a way of, again, of prompting people who are qualified to talk about Portuguese post-colonialism to begin a discussion there. And it's the same way, here in the Netherlands, I during my interview for this position, I was asked, how will you represent Dutch design in architecture and digital culture? And I said, well, I actually can't represent Dutch architecture, design, and digital culture, but what I can do is talk about my reflections on it, from my perspective, and also more importantly, talk about what the New Institute is doing in these realms, and all the amazing collaborators who we work with are doing.
Taking on what you were saying, Aric, last 2 years have been difficult and have led us to various change in thinking and human behavior and human pattern have changed, especially the current generation, or the generation which are at the realm of being students and then going to be practicing professionals tomorrow. Cultural situations have moved. Whole process of evaluation and reevaluation have changed. What shift do you see as the role which you play in, and the role which institutes like yourself play in the change in critical thinking? Is there a change in language or ideology or the presentation tactics and examples which reflects on where we are as far as critical thinking is concerned.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you bring that up, because this is one of the big questions for me now at the New Institute, and one that I sort of feel most strongly about, strongly towards. So I think, in recent years, a lot of cultural institutions have rightly turned their attentions towards addressing this laundry list of crises and urgencies, social, ecological, and so on that we're confronted with, and that's absolutely what we should be doing. The only thing is, we have largely confronted these issues through speculation, posing questions, raising awareness, issuing calls to action, both through what we do as institutions, but also through the work that we show, right? And especially in the area of design and architecture. A lot of these sort of socially engaged works that we've been and projects that we've been exhibiting. Now that's all really important, but the issue now, though, is, I think, and that should continue. But the issue now is that I think we can all agree that we are now running out of time to just speculate, pose questions, raise awareness, and issue calls to action now. So for me, what I think we need to be doing is to start enacting some of these speculations that we've been proffering for at least the past 10 or more years. That we should become testing grounds for a sort of enacted speculation, because as cultural institutions we can. And what that means essentially is using ourselves as guinea pigs and putting words to actions. Now, a few examples I can give on our part, and every institution has its own situation. So the way in which this will play out would necessarily be different for each institution. But for us, we have one of our research teams, led by Klaas Kuitenbrouwer, has over the past few years been developing this notion of a ZOAP, which is essentially a framework for bringing non-human interests and voices into organizational decision making as a part of bringing more inclusive and ecologically regenerative practices into what we do. And there's been a lot of work and thinking that's gone into this. It sounds simple, but it's really the result of a lot of deep thinking and research. And we just announced recently that in the first half of next year, we will become the world's first ZOAP. So we're actually going to implement this, and we're also speaking with and working with other organizations who are interested in implementing this as well. And we'll see how it goes. Another area that we are now investigating, we're just sort of starting, is what do museums often sort of, in looking for new revenue streams, one of the things museums always sort of fall back on is the museum store. Now, we're sort of fortunate in that our store is basically a bookshop right now, and we don't rely on it so much for income. So that means that we actually have freedom to play with what a store can be, without sort of feeling without worrying about sort of risk, financial risk in that sense. And so what we can do is, based on the observation that a lot of designers now have been questioning, their complicity, in a lot of the extractive practices that are causing so much social and ecological damage, and sort of questioning what the role of design is. They've been also looking at, because of this, we've seen a flood of proposals in recent years from especially design students who seek to redefine what it means to consume, redefine the ways in which we undertake exchange, and redefine how we assign value to things. So these are kind of other than capitalist ways of generating economies. So we're looking at how we actually turn some of these proposals into products and have a store, and have a store that allows for us to test these other than capitalist or extra capitalist or supra capitalist sorts of ways of looking at consumption and production and exchange, still within a market system, such that we can kind of stress test what the possibilities are between these aspirations and current realities. And we can do this because we're a cultural institution. Our job is to is to sometimes be impractical in order to see how things work. And of course, we'll learn from it and share what we learn, and we can fail. It's okay. So I see the role of cultural institutions to, we still do all the important work that we're doing, but I think we need to sort of take things a little bit, take things a few steps further, and begin to enact some of the values that we, values and ideas that we promote.
That's great, because, and especially when we're talking to a generation which has a completely different thinking process, and their neurons are wired very differently currently. So, I mean, that's quite heartening to know.
Yeah, well, I mean, this goes back to Samta's question about, the distinction between architecture, design, and digital culture. I think this sort of perennial question of what is design, what is art, what is architecture, these questions around disciplinary boundaries, I think they're only a concern of, I would say, my generation and above. When I talk to younger students or younger designers, I don't think they care. Like I really don't. It's just not an issue, and I find that very encouraging as well.
So I think very interestingly, you said quite a few things in your previous answer, which touched upon many other inquiries that we had for you today. From this whole idea of beyond human or non-human centered design, because also a lot of, onus of today's environmental crisis lies on this whole shift of human centered design. And now there are people, who are talking about how to kind of place the human within the larger circle of other. So reposition from that perspective. And there are interesting things that we're seeing in terms of projects mostly that are happening. But also that brings me back to a reference of this letter that in 2017, there was an open letter that Victor Margolin and Ezio Manzini wrote, calling upon the design community for looking at design and democracy as a topic, and the role of design within a democracy. And I mean, while democracy itself may have its own philosophical criticism, but if we for now park that aside, I wonder, given the fact that mostly how we see design in a market kind of a setup, design is always done for a client, which means a designer is constantly creating on commission in a way. And hence, how much freedom does a designer really have to make these really big impacts if the context, the market within which we exist, the designers exist, do not sort of really shift their perspective? And that seems to be a challenge to me that I haven't really been able to find sort of an answer, and I was hoping to hear your views on that.
Yeah, so I mean, having said what I just said, this goes back to the question of what is design, right? And ergo, what is the role of the designer? And I would, as I've said before, one of the things I love about design is that, if you ask 20 people what design is, you'll get 20 different answers, right? But I think what this really speaks to is the kind of fluidity of thinking that is at the root of design. Design is not, for me, design is actually not a task, but it's really a sort of mode of navigation, negotiation, mediation, and articulation, right? Whether you're articulating an object or an idea or a system or a way of working, a way of thinking, it's how we make visible and articulate the world or worlds in which that we inhabit, which is why when we talk about sort of non-human perspectives, we're of course we're still humans, and we'll never stop. Well, at least for the foreseeable future, we'll never stop being humans. But so then, what the role of design then in bringing about these the sort of non-human centered way of thinking and working is to articulate the different vocalities of non-human entities, right? So to go back to your question, then I think really, if we see design as a form of negotiation, it's also a form of persuasion then also. So, if you're talking about design as a profession that is still very much dependent on the market system and clients and so on and so forth, then I would argue then that the role of the designer is to is to work with the client in sort of rethinking the way they do things and in opening up possibilities. And I would argue with, perhaps with great optimism, which may be justified or not, that I think that this is becoming less and less difficult to do, because I think the sort of, if you look at some of the there is a palpable shift going on in which clients and customers and so on and so forth are really starting to see that the ways of doing things or the ways in which we've been doing things in the past are really not sustainable and can't continue. So I think there is a lot more openness now from the client side, and a lot more pressure from the market side to do things differently. And who is better to show us how to do things differently than designers? The World Around was started a few years ago by Beatrice Galilei. In fact, it had its origins at the Metropolitan Museum when Beatrice was architecture curator there. And it's basically like a year in review. So I think Beatrice first called it a year of architecture in one day when she was at the Met. And essentially it's a way of highlighting some of the most consequential and noteworthy players and projects of the past year. Now, of course, this includes a real range of efforts spanning kind of well-known buildings that of course many of us will have seen over the past year, but also I think really importantly, it's a great platform for allowing younger practices and practitioners and practitioners broadly defined, people who don't necessarily make buildings per se, but are engaged in various social practices or ways of expanding architecture and its applications and manifestations. So we're really happy that we'll be able to co-host, well, first of all, this year's World Around will for the first time take place in two venues, and we're really thrilled to be one of them. On January 29th, it'll take place in Rotterdam at the New Institute, and then 1 week later, it'll be at the Guggenheim in New York. And it really fits in well with the New Institute's sort of global scope, but also our interest in not just presenting, but talking about current and impactful developments in the field.